And so we benefit from trade if these agreements are fair, if they're negotiated properly, and if they're enforced correctly. Now, let me give you an example in my part of the world that's really troubling and that this Congress needs to do something about, and that's the issue of illegal logging. And it ties into the whole issue of the environment and how I think Republicans want to take care of the environment that we have, especially in our forests. There is an enormous amount of illegal logging going on overseas to satisfy the wood demand that we have right here in the United States and elsewhere. But we're the big importers in many cases. According to the G8 illegal logging dialogue, which happened in Berlin in June of this year, 40% of illegally cut timber is attributable to imports to the G8 countries, and the United States is responsible for a quarter of those imports. Now, these are what's going on around the world. I don't think most Americans are aware of. I wasn't. Washington Post did a terrific story on it. I've now read some other studies. Brazil, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Russia appear to supply, but not necessarily from all their own forests, the great majority of this illegal timber. There may be laws on the books saying, don't cut here. But that doesn't stop rogue provinces and illegal operators from doing that. Now, why does that matter? Because here in the United States, this Congress and this government has clamped down on our domestic production of timber off our forested lands, especially in the West. 80% reduction since 1990. And meanwhile, wildfires ravage America's forests. I tell you, Congressman Sessions, if Theodore Roosevelt were alive today, he created these forest reserves in 1905, he'd be rolling over in his grave to watch how mismanaged they are. We had more than 8 million acres go up in fire this year, nearly a record. We're on a track for a record each of these last few years. It cost the taxpayers of America $1.2 billion so far, and we're not done with the fire season, so far to extinguish these blazes.
So if the gentleman would yield.
I would yield.
Tonight we're talking about the Republican vision versus the Democrat agenda. Smaller, smarter, common sense government versus ineffective, wasteful, intrusive government. Forestry may be one of those issues that would fit right in here, and I would yield to the gentleman.
It absolutely is one of those issues. When Republicans were in control of this assembly, and I'm sorry to sound partisan on this, but it's just the way it is in the clash of philosophies on this particular issue. While we had some bipartisan help, I chaired the Forestry Subcommittee in the House Resources Committee, and we held hearing after hearing after hearing on these issues. And we marked up and passed legislation, some of which made it all the way into law, some of which was bipartisan and passed this assembly. But unfortunately today, the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the House, the Democrat Caucus Chair, the Resources Committee Chair, and the Rules Committee Chairwoman all voted against, for example, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which did become law, which allows some thinning of our forests, not as much as I'd like to see, but helps streamline it. And the whole leadership of this Democrat Congress voted against that in the House. So it makes it almost impossible to go the next step to help stop these wildfires from ravaging our forests, to get back to common sense management of our timber. I want to show an example here of a fire that occurred in my district. This is the example of the Egley fire. And the Egley fire burned about 140,000 acres of America's grasslands and forest lands out in Harney County. 140,000 acres. You see the devastation? These two children are the grandchildren of the county judge there, a Democrat, Steve Grasty. And they're standing there as a stark example of the future that they're now inheriting. Some of this area burned before. Some of this area has been basically made off limits. We think you ought to go in there and remove the burned dead trees while they still have value and restart a new forest sooner. And we had legislation that passed the Republican House last year. It was bipartisan that would have gotten that going. Unfortunately, the Senate never.
So the opportunity to go in and clear, if the gentleman will yield, the opportunity to allow this burned timber to be harvested would mean that bugs and all the things which might find a way to eat this timber or weaken it, rather than clearing it and getting started again, is in the process of decay, not health at this time. I would yield back.
I'll tell you what's worse. We have a lot of cattle ranchers out there who have permits to graze on some of this ground. Because of the intensity of this fire, it may be a year or two before the grasses come back and they'd be allowed to graze. They're having now today, literally today, with the price of hay being what it is and the demand, they're having to liquidate their herds. Some of them may go completely out of business, all because these lands aren't being properly managed. Now, for our friends who are concerned about global warming and greenhouse gas emissions, I serve on the Select Committee on Climate Change and Energy Independence. A fire that burns as intensely or more so than this one probably emits 100 tons of greenhouse gas emissions for every acre. 100 tons per acre. This burned 140,000 acres. A good, green, healthy, growing forest, like a lot of them we have in the Northwest, will sequester between 4 and 6 tons of carbon per acre. So wouldn't you think that this Congress would be focusing on doing better management on our forests? And yet, the subcommittee that I used to chair, it's now been compressed in with the Parks Subcommittee into one, has held one hearing in 9.5 months on this issue. They've marked up no legislation dealing with this issue. Nothing's happening of consequence, except taxpayers are spending $1.2 billion to fight these blazes. Future these kids are looking at is a long way off. I like my forests green and healthy, not black, but some of the groups out there who appeal even thinning in these areas issued a statement recently that said burn forests are healthy forests. Now, I suppose in the enormous scope of time they grow back, we know that. But I don't think burn forests are the policy that Americans want us to have when it comes to their forests. It doesn't work well for habitat, for water quality and watersheds. Meanwhile, I'll bet we don't cut a stick of this, or very little of it. Instead, because this will get litigated because we won't change the law here, which is what needs to happen, even though you and I would do it, and you've been helpful in these efforts. Instead, we'll proudly go to the local store and get our furniture made in China from illegally harvested wood from countries that have no environmental laws, where the forests are extraordinarily important around the equator to sequester carbon. Do you see why? I don't understand the ineffective, wasteful vision of the other side, when I believe no land manager in America would allow this to occur and wouldn't go in right afterward. Counties don't do it where they own forest land. Private foresters don't allow this to occur. They get in right away. I've been out on sites. They get in right away. They clean it up. Our state of Oregon has a very progressive Forest Practices Act, but they don't wait. They don't wait a year. It'll be a year before they're done with the Forest Service writing their plan, and then it'll be subject to appeal and litigation, most likely for another year.
Gentlemen will yield.